Mike Smith, how you doing?
I'm doing well, Dr. Thunder. How you doing?
I'm doing all right. I'm doing all
Okay,
right.
now what I was expecting is I was expecting a theme song. You don't have a theme song that you play before your broadcast?
Well, I'm approaching episode 100, and I have some new wrinkles that I'm going to put in there, some new images, new promotional stuff, and along with that, I think there's probably going to be some kind of music in the beginning, but all of that stuff gets added in post production.
So all right, now, so if you were to, now of course obviously you compose tunes and you play, but if you were to pick like a tune, one tune that would be your theme song from some of the great music out there, what would be your theme song?
Oh man. There's a million tunes that I mean.
When I used to, I used to do a podcast when I was teaching history rock and roll at the University of Northern Colorado, and I was doing a podcast when I taught in the off months in between the fall and winter semester and in the summers. And since it was a rock and roll class, I used Jimi Hendrix "Message of Love," the end of Jimi Hendrix "Message of Love." So that was I had a whole podcast sign on and sign off and all that. So yeah, so yeah, you need a theme song.
Yeah, I thought about that. I had a YouTube series called Lesson of the Week, and I had a whole music. It was original music, the beginning, and it had like glimpses of me doing different things, teaching and playing and stuff like that. But it was probably a little too long. So I got to be sensitive about that, because folks nowadays, they just want to get right into it.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, and some of this evidenced by the brevity of a lot of TV shows, the music TV shows.
Right. Yeah. As you say that, you don't hear theme songs like you used to back in the day. Every show had this really familiar theme song, so you don't hear that anymore. So you make a point there. That's kind of maybe it's an outdated notion, but I still say you should have a theme song.
Yeah. What is it? Mike Post.
Oh yeah, Hill Street Blues.
Yeah, and Cagney and Lacey, and he did of course Law and Order. He wrote the theme to that. Yeah, that's one of my favorite shows. Especially SVU.
Oh yeah.
Show's still on. It's still on, and it's still good.
I was gonna say it's been on for a while, so maybe it's the theme song. See, that's what I'm talking about. You get your theme song, and you all of a sudden you go national. You got a national broadcast going, man.
Yeah, and I think they use the same music for the different flavors of the Law and Order show.
The Law and Order, each one of the franchises as they go to different places.
Right, and but the arrangement's a little bit different. Like part of the melody, like you get into the bridge, and part of the melody is like it's on soprano saxophone, one of them, and it's like on clarinet.
Oh yeah,
one of them, right?
Give it the flavor of whatever location they happen to be in.
Yeah,
yeah.
Well, Mike, we know each other because we work together at Ohio State.
We do.
So we were both hired by. Well, your hire was a spousal hire, right? But
I was hired. Ted had a lot to do with that. Ted and Jan Edwards and marching and athletic bands and my ex-wife also was hired. Yeah. So yeah, you're right in that regard, that was a part of that.
But really, I was just trying to get to, Dr. McDaniel and how he's put together a fine program, and we're the beneficiaries of that.
Yeah. He's, I consider him a real close friend, but he's also a mentor. I didn't go to Ohio State, of course, but he's a mentor in that the kinds of things that he liked to do as far as the research and a lot of the academic work, we both have that in common, and that the looking at jazz through an American filter. I think that that's something that we both do, and that whole idea of, thinking of jazz in the broader term of American music. I know that's one of the things that he and we talk about that a lot.
Yeah, so, I know, I don't know everything, but I think I know a good amount about the diversity of skills that you have. So you work with athletic bands at Ohio State, but then you're in jazz studies. You were on the music ed faculty for a period of time. You direct one of our big bands. You also direct the Fusion Combo, which I think is apropos, for your diversity of musical taste. And I remember hearing, we have the jazz camp at Ohio State, and some of your stories about your earliest experiences, with music and all the different kinds of things that you played, and something about being polka king or something. Being a Chicagoan, here's an interesting thing. I think that the one thing that I was able to do that might have been different from a lot of other people that I grew up with on the South Side is I was able to bridge a lot of different musical worlds. Part of that had to do with the fact that where I went to school, where I got my undergraduate degree, Northeastern Illinois University, I connected with a lot of people that I might not have had the opportunity to connect with had I not gone there, had I gone to some other places. And so there are a lot of Jewish folks there, a lot of, just a lot of just a varied background. And Chicago, unbeknownst to a lot of people, has the second largest Polish population outside of Warsaw, Poland. So there are a lot of Polish folks in Chicago. And as a consequence, there are a lot of people that like polka. Now, here's another weird thing. Not that this is the polka, Sean Wallace's polka time podcast or YouTube channel, but there are two different schools of polka. There's the Chicago school and the Cleveland school. And it's funny because it's almost like East Coast, West Coast rap rivalries. They don't like one another. There's this whole difference between those two. But the point was that I got in with some guys, and a guy said to me, "Hey, I play in a polka band." This guy I used to work with, a sax player, did some jazz, and a guy I used to teach with, he was an Italian guy, but he played in polka bands. So he said, "Hey man, I got some gigs playing at this polka band and we need a drummer. Can you do it?" I said, "Well, what do I need?" He said, "You need a bow tie." I'm like, "I'm on it, man. I'm gonna play it." So, and because I'm in Chicago and you hear stuff like the Beer Barrel Polka, Too Fat Polka, she's too fat for me, too fat for me. I don't want her, you could have her, she's too fat for me. So, you got all these different Pennsylvania polka, Beer Barrel Polka, all of these different tunes. So it became kind of a joke because I'm the only black dude in Chicago playing polka gigs, and so, but I actually got the moniker, the Black Polka King Black Polka King of Chicago, from a guy in Colorado named Corey Peterson, who was a band director. And I told him that story about playing polkas. And so he came up with the moniker, the Black Polka King of Chicago. And I figured, well, you got Michael Jackson as the king of pop, the godfather of soul, the queen of soul. Hell, I'll be the Black Polka King in Chicago. I'm guaranteed to be the only one. So, I'll take that honorific. So that's a small part of my, but yeah, I played some polkas, man.
Thank you so much for watching my video so far. If you'd like to support, there are several ways to do so below. Also, likes are free. Please comment, share, and subscribe. Now back to the video.
It's an interesting world. And the people who love polkas, when you play these gigs, the people who love polkas, I mean, they're seriously into it. There's a serious world.
Speaking to your taste, your diversity in taste in music, the Jazz Lab Band last school year did a Steely Dan concert.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I am a big Steely Dan fan. Now, it's interesting when you think about a person who I'm 60 years old. So I came up in the 60s and the 70s, and so I'm really cutting my teeth playing. Started, I started playing young. I was a kid when I started playing in bands and all that. But so in the late 60s, early 70s is when you start to shape your identity as a musician and the things you listen to. So I'm listening to soul music, which is something that's happening in Chicago. As far as you're a black kid in the 60s in Chicago, you listen to soul music. You listen to James Brown. I'm going to listen to Motown. You're going to listen to Stax record stuff, Chicago sound, Curtis Mayfield, Jerry Butler, and all that kind of stuff. But then my parents are both, my dad was, my mom, both really big music fans. So my dad particularly listened to amazing amount of jazz. I mean, he was a jazz historian, an amateur. That was his hobby. He was a jazz historian, just collected all kind of jazz records. Blues, big band, organ jazz. He was a really big fan of organ jazz. So, you have that. Then I started getting into rock and roll. My sister she's listening to some soul music, but she's also listening to rock and roll. I got some cousins that introducing me to Jimi Hendrix and different things like that. So I'm kind of listening to everything. And in the 70s on the radio, on FM radio, this is when FM radio really starts to become this big thing. First, it was underground. And when FM radio started in late 60s, early 70s, the folks who owned these radio companies, the radio stations, they didn't know what to do with FM radio at first. So FM radio was kind of the repository of everything. So you had stations that would play John Coltrane, they would play Led Zeppelin, they play Weather Report, they play Steely Dan, they play Aretha Franklin. There are a lot of different stations. And then later, as more and more people started to listen to FM radio, you started to have this segmented Black FM, classic rock and all that. But for a while in the late 60s, early 70s, there were stations like WXRT in Chicago that would play just about everything. I mean, they play all different kind of music. And that's where you start. And of course, Steely Dan had a couple really big hits in about 1972, 71, 72, 72. Do It Again, Reeling in the Years, really big. And something about that band just caught on with me, clicked. And what it was is it played to all the different things that I was really into when I was, younger, getting into music. They had that pop sensibility, but these cats, they played long solos over rock changes. And then they started playing, having jazz players. Snooky Young played on their first album. They had people like Jim Horn. They had, they had all these great players. Ray Brown played on the second album. And all of a sudden you see these rock guys that are really big jazz fans, and that starts to creep into their music. And all of a sudden you get all these jazz references and all these obscure different literary references, and it played to all the different things that I like. So I started listening to Steely Dan. And of course, the one of the greatest albums of all time, as far as I'm concerned, Asia. So Asia comes out, I'm a senior in high school, and I'm into music, and I'm loving, all different kinds of fusion. I'm listening to Weather Report. I'm listening to Return to Forever. I'm listening to Herbie Hancock's Headhunters. I'm listening to Billy Cobham, and all of that kind of stuff. And at the same time, I'm listening to progressive rock. I'm listening to P-Funk and everything else. And so Asia comes along, and Asia's got all of these great players. Bernard Purdy's playing on there. You got Steve Gadd playing on the title track, and that's one of Steve Gadd's signature tunes. Is Asia, and one of the signature sessions for him. And you got all these great players playing on there. Wayne Short is playing tenor sax on the tune Asia. And you got all these great players, and that becomes one of my absolute touchstone albums when I'm really forming myself as a musician. That album, to this day, I can listen to it front to back, and it holds up as well as, for me, as well as Kind of Blue, which is another one of those touchstone albums. It holds up as well as Interventions by Stevie Wonder, Giant Steps, Coach. I mean, it holds up. Weather Report, that Asia album really holds up for me. Now, so here's what happened. I started to see all of these different arrangements. And actually, this goes back probably 10, 15 years ago. There was a guy named Fred Sturm who was at what's the college in Appleton, Wisconsin. What's the name of that school? But he was the band director. He's passed away since then. But he was the band director at I can't remember the name of that school. He starts to arrange a lot of these.
What's the location of the school?
In Appleton, Wisconsin, and Fred Sturm is his name.
Lawrence University?
Lawrence. He's at Lawrence University. That's what it is. Yeah. He was at Lawrence University, and he was the band director there. So jazz band director. He starts to arrange a lot of these Steely Dan tunes for jazz band. And, you know, players of my age, that's a reference for a lot of jazz players my age. That Steely Dan is one of those references that, you know, kind of crosses a lot of different categories. But Fred Sturm starts to come out with these arrangements. All of a sudden, you start to see more and more arrangements for jazz band of the Steely Dan music. And as it turns out, I started to find all of these different arrangements of the tunes off of the Asia album. And I thought, hey, we could do that. And I had a band. I had some players last year in that jazz lab band that I thought, man, this material will fit that band very, very well. And so we did that album, and I thought it was a huge success. I thought it was a great, great concert. But what it showed to me is, and one of the things that it said to me is that we don't have to relegate jazz band. That doesn't have to be the sole domain of Duke Ellington. Now, Duke Ellington is my ultimate American music hero. He's the greatest composer America has ever produced, as far as I'm concerned. And so you got those great band traditions. You got you did the Basie concert the other night. You guys played amazingly well on that stuff. I mean, I can listen to Basie all night. I can listen to Ellington all night. I can listen to Mingus. But one of the things that Miles Davis proved is that the jazz world has to be a lot bigger than the classic jazz, you know, that idea of, you know, just doing the Ellington repertoire and the swing stuff, Benny Goodman stuff, Tommy Dorsey, jazz. And jazz has always been that style of music that has started to encompass all different kinds of things. The classic example of that is Miles. You think about the You're Under Arrest album, where he does Time After Time by Cyndi Lauper. He does Human Nature, Michael Jackson. He does this tune on Tutu called Perfect Way by a band called Scritti Politti. And so you see all these different musicians that bring other things into jazz that you don't usually think of as being, John Coltrane doing My Favorite Things. You know, I mean, that's something that comes out of Broadway. And when John Coltrane did it, all of a sudden it became a jazz standard where it hadn't been before, which is the same thing that Duke Ellington was doing before when he did The Peanut Vendor. He brought in his tune that wasn't a part of the jazz catalog. Duke Ellington's band was the first one to play The Peanut Vendor. Now everybody plays The Peanut Vendor. And to a certain degree, Duke Ellington was the guy that created kind of that Latin jazz thing in early 30s when he started to do The Peanut Vendor. So you've always had people that brought in, or, you know, think about the Gershwin stuff, Embraceable You, The Man I Love. You think about Ella Fitzgerald doing all that stuff, and the Cole Porter stuff. I Get a Kick Out of You. And of course, Charlie Parker. I did a Charlie Parker concert just last week. Charlie Parker with strings, and he's doing Embraceable You, and he's doing Laura, and he's doing all of these tunes. So going back to that Steely Dan thing, one of the things that I really appreciated about being able to do that concert was that we now have an understanding that Steely Dan can exist in the jazz band world, right along with Basie, Ellington, Mingus, Kenton, and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think it always could. In my experience, all the different kinds of bands that I've played in, and all the great musicians that I know, they're not these sort of lines of demarcation. That it's not really. You can't work by being that specific. Right.
Yeah.
So you have to be willing to do whatever it is. And, you talked about Miles, he famously said, don't call it jazz, social music. And I think what he was saying by that is, well, first of all, the term jazz is not particularly descriptive because it covers such a broad array of different kinds of styles. But I think the most important thing about jazz, as in contradistinction to a Western art music tradition, is that jazz is intended to be played in social situations where it's like a community thing. It's a gatherings. I mean, it's cultural. It's relational. It's all of those things. It's music that is happening in those kinds of settings, as opposed to sitting in a concert hall quietly as, each movement is played back to back.
But you know what? But you know what's interesting about that, Sean, is that classical music used to be that as well. And it's interesting how the whole concept, and this is one of the things that I worry about. And I rail about this from time to time when I can get on my soapbox and I can rail about this. One of the problems, I shouldn't say problem, because I love the fact that people will sit and listen to jazz and people don't appreciate it. The problem with jazz, I think, is that there are folks who fear jazz because they think it's something that you have to go in and sit down and you have to dress up for, and I don't mind people dressing up. I like dressing up myself. But there's a feeling amongst people that jazz has become what classical music was, that really kind of off-putting thing where you have to have a certain amount of understanding about it. You have to be, it's a learned music. You have to be well learned. You have to have some social lessons on when to clap and not to clap and all those kinds of things, which is what classical music became, but classical music didn't start out that way. The reason that operas have overtures is because back in the day, they had to play the overture to get people to put the drinks down, man, and stop talking and stop boozing it up and come in, because people were just hanging. And it's really interesting that classical music really kind of, to a certain degree, didn't do itself a favor by becoming that stuffy thing. Now, there's a certain amount of mystique to classical music that I think is great in that regard. I like the fact that you dress up and you go to the theater and to hear classical music, but most people don't like to dress up. Same thing with jazz. I like the fact that jazz is something that you can put on a tie and you can put on a hat and go out to a nice jazz club and really kind of really have a good time with it, or go to Jazz at Lincoln Center and hear Wynton, or go hear the Carnegie Jazz Band, or go to the Jazz Arts in Columbus with Byron Stripling. And, that's a wonderful thing. And it's a great, great thing to have those things. But the problem is, I think we live in a vernacular society now. You know what I'm saying? We live in a society that doesn't like manners and doesn't like dressing up and doesn't like having to sit down and listen to this, even if they might
doesn't like to learn anything, have to know something to be able to appreciate something fully.
Right.
Very sort of instant gratification kind of thing. You know, so you know, in our pop music demonstrates that, as you know, because pop music, Motown used to be pop music, right?
Yeah.
So, but you know, that's a far cry from WAP, right?
You're not going there now.
that's a far cry. It's a far cry how sort of low everything has gotten, and people just expect to just they just expect to like it right away or not like it, and that's not the way. You know, I'll tell you a story. You know, my dad was my teacher all the way until I went to high school. I'm sorry, all the way until I went to college. Right. Through high school, all the way until I went to college. And I remember he assigned me an etude. My dad was a great saxophone player. He had a very specific philosophy and, you know, approach. And, you know, I got 3-4 lessons every week. And, the living room in the old house that they still live in, it's been renovated. Still has a Michigan dungeon basement, right? You know, in those old houses, they waste a lot of space, and so the staircase going to the second floor, where all the bedrooms were, there was just nothing under there. So he cut a hole out of the wall, and he made a practice room in there. And he padded the room and everything so it wouldn't be, you know, too loud. But he was literally sitting feet away from me with, you know, but I was, you know, in the room with the door closed, and so he could hear everything I was practicing. And I remember once, I think we must have had some friends over or something. And so I went upstairs to practice, which wasn't usual. And he told me, he said, you know, practice this music. This is the selection you're going to practice. I don't remember what it was. And I told him, he said, well, but I don't really like that one. I don't really like that. And so he says, well, do this, learn it, you know, and then after you have learned it and you can play it well, then if you don't like it, then you don't have to play it anymore. And the most remarkable thing happened, and of course he knew this was going to happen. Once I had skin in the game, I liked it. It was easy for me to find. Well, first of all, it was a good piece of music, right? But it was easy for me to appreciate it because I had invested something into it, right? So I had created meaning and put meaning into it by spending that time, that equity, you know, and but that's not the kind of thing that people today really want to have to deal with, you know. I mean, we can go all kinds of different directions with this. You know, one of my favorite topics is just this idea of low information voters, right? Mm-hmm. So low information voters that don't know anything about anything. They don't know candidates' voting history. They don't know, you know, they don't know any piece of legislation. They don't know anything about any issues that are going to be on the ballot. They might as well just be totally guessing, right? As opposed to people that, you know, they take it seriously and they do their homework. They feel like, hey, this is something important and I need to do this. I interviewed, well, you were talking about Steely Dan. I interviewed Walt Weiskopf also, but I interviewed Branford. Branford Marsalis. And he's in a documentary film, I want to say it's early 2000s, called Before the Music Dies. And in that documentary film, he says, and he's pretty regularly cited, from him saying this in this documentary film. He says, if you want to guarantee that you get something wrong, just get 100 people in a room and have them vote on it. but what he's saying is, I think part of what he's implying is and this was before social media was as big as it is now. It's even more that way now. So like, if I can't give it a like or a thumbs down, then I'm ready to move on to something else,
Yeah.
And I think that's a general issue and problem, that you have that whole sophistication of the audience and how that plays into, being able to create music at a certain level. But then you have that juxtaposed against what does the audience actually want? What do the people actually want? And so how much are you supposed to play to that? And how much are you supposed to serve as sort of an ambassador and as a person that's, educating the audience as they're playing and performing?
Well, and I think part of that is the fact that now it's easy for everybody because now, first of all, I don't want to be the guy that blames everything on cyberspace and social media and the internet. Because that's easy to do. And there's a whole lot of stuff that we can draw back to that. But one of the things that I think, and tying in kind of what you're talking about, my theory is this: you used to have to be exposed to things that you didn't know because you didn't have the ability to go in your own little corner of cyberspace. You had to be exposed. Okay, now I'm going to show my age a little bit, but I want to talk about the fact that in the 60s, you had, depending on where you were, you had 3 television networks. You had CBS, NBC, ABC. Now in Chicago, you had more than that. You had WGN, and then you had Channel 32, and then you had Channel 11. So you had, for a long time in the 60s, you had, at most 6, maybe 7 stations, but for the most part. Now, where I'm going with this is this. Because of that, if you were going to, let's say you're watching TV, and in the 60s, if you're watching TV on a Sunday, you were probably going to watch Ed Sullivan, or you're going to watch whatever Ed Sullivan's competitor variety show was. But in watching Ed Sullivan, I had to see, and I love seeing, you would see all these different, you see people spinning plates, you see all kind of stuff, but you see Duke Ellington on Ed Sullivan, you see James Brown on Ed Sullivan, you see Tony Bennett on Ed Sullivan, you see Ethel Merman on Ed Sullivan, so we had this wide range of different kind of music that we were literate in because this is the kind of stuff, whether we wanted to or not, we saw it. And to a certain degree, that was kind of the way it was on the radio for a while. For a while on the radio in the 60s, particularly when Motown started to get big, something that most people don't even realize. The Beatles were bigger in Black communities first before they were big in white communities. The Beatles were known by Black folks before white folks. And there's one real simple reason for that. Because the Beatles, when they first came to America, before they came to America, their American distributor, EMI's American distributor, Capitol Records, didn't want to have anything to do with them. So VJ Records, which is a small Black label out of Chicago and Gary, Indiana, distributed Beatles records before Capitol did. And they distributed those records to Black radio stations. So as a consequence, Black people were listening to the Beatles before white folks were. And it was something. Now, the reason that I bring that up is that when I was a kid, we listened to James Brown and Sam and Dave and Aretha Franklin and the Supremes. But we also listened to the Beatles, listened to the Rolling Stones. This was something, the Monkees, even though they were terrible, but the Monkees, you heard all these different things. Then you also, and this is something I was thinking about the other day, and I've thought about this a lot. there was Leonard Bernstein had a show called the Young People's Concerts, where he would do these concerts for young people in New York City, for kids in New York City, where he talk about classical music and he'd explain it. And that's where, and as you know, I talk about, and sometimes too much, but I talk about music all the time in my concerts. That's where I got that concept from. I got that from Leonard Bernstein because I loved hearing about all of this music. But because of that, I was exposed to classical music. My mom liked to listen to classical music on the radio. I was exposed to easy listening music, stuff like the Ray Conniff Orchestra, Mantovani, all of this really kind of cheesy stuff that I still have a fondness for in my heart. It's some terrible stuff that I really love. But because of that, because of being exposed to all of that kind of stuff, as country music. As a matter of fact, both my parents listen to country music. Not a whole lot. I had an uncle who actually listened to a whole lot of country music, but my parents listened to some country music. So I never learned to dislike any kind of music. And as a consequence, there are all these different kinds of music. And I would go a little bit further to say that that is the experience of a lot of folks my age, a lot of Black folks my age who grew up in the 60s. They were exposed to a lot of different kinds of music. Prince was a really big Joni Mitchell fan, as I am now. I am a big Joni Mitchell fan, and I know Prince talked about that all the time. And those kinds of things that I think plays in, and as a consequence, now tying back into what you were talking about, there wasn't necessarily instant gratification. One of the things that I believe is that we were real kind of musical explorers. There are a lot of people who are musical explorers, and they would look to find different kinds of music that that turned them on. They really get into. When I got into classical music, my head just exploded. And so there was this whole expectation that music was much more, and there was a whole lot more to music than just one chord, simple kinds of stuff. Now there was some cool stuff that was happening that was very simple. But there was, I think, the expectation, and to a certain degree, I think there's still an expectation out there for a lot of people that the world of music is a lot wider than a lot of the simplistic stuff that you might hear. There's some hip hop stuff that I actually can like. I can't say I'm a huge hip hop fan, but there is some stuff that I like.
Well, I think the stuff that's out today has gone through some of the same sort of degradation in sort of quality, like lyricism and even sampling, the stuff that's sampled.
Sure.
If you listen to like Tribe Called Quest,
right,
then the kind of stuff that they're sampling is all of the, it's all jazz stuff. It's a bunch of like really heavy stuff.
Yeah.
And the lyricism, I think, is also on that there's a cleverness, and then there's also like a breadth of subject matter, right?
Yeah.
As opposed to the sort of formula for success now, which is baby, take your clothes off, and by the way, do you like these gold chains I have?
But but here's something interesting about that, and I forget the name of the documentary. There's a documentary that was out in the 90s. I can't even remember what the name of it. But when I used to teach history rock and roll, I used to talk about this documentary a lot, because there is a lot of truth to the fact that the reason that kind of stuff is out there now is because that's what sells. That's what is pushed. I mean, think about it. The record industry has always been what it is now, about the money. Billy Joel has a famous quote that says, if the devil was to go into business, the business that the devil would go into would be the record business. Because when you think about all of the gangsters that were a part of the record business, and you think about all of these guys, these fly-by-night guys that were in there, and sometimes they had great, great, great people, but they weren't interested in the music. They were interested in the business end of it. And that's why you had, I mean, I'm not going to name names because your broadcast goes out far and wide, and I could get sued by naming some names and maybe even some family members of some of those old people from the past that were like Roulette Records, man. If you know the history of Roulette Records, man, there was some shady stuff going on there. But my point is that those people now, the record titans are the same way. They don't particularly care about whether or not this is good or bad or whatever the case may be. Now, one of the things, Sean, that you and I both have to come to grips with is that we are not the market for that kind of stuff that's out there. You know, Megan Thee Stallion, you know, and then what she does, I guess she does it really, really well. I mean, it's to me, it's kind of like, but in what she does, I hear that she works hard at what she does. You know, and so, but I have to remember, I'm not the audience for that. So, but there are people out there now, like Lizzo, who I absolutely love. I love everything about Lizzo, man. I think that she is phenomenal. There's some stuff that's out there now and Lizzo, of course, is much more of a singer than, you know, and the flute player and all of that. But she's got, you know, a little bit of that whole kind of street thing happening. But she's phenomenal. There are some people out there, but I think that what we have to, and I think the other thing is that we are showing our age when we say, man, that stuff, that WAP stuff, that terrible stuff, which, you know, I hear that and I go, I can't believe I'm hearing that. Then I start to think, man, I sound like my folks. I'm showing my age.
So my issue with that song, and the reason I brought it up, because so several things. One, it is not my intention to behave in a way which would suggest that I think that it's easy to create a hit, because it is not. It was perhaps the hardest thing to do. Mm-hmm. And you can know exactly what the market is. You can cater to the market. You can try to forecast. You can do everything, and you can't make a hit. And usually, folks that have a lot of sort of a lot of education in music, that usually pushes them further and further away from the ability to write a hit. Mm-hmm. That's usually what happens. And so I'm not belittling that skill or the production that goes into creating a great show. I mean, you know, I had with the show band. I mean, now, you know, we weren't doing WAP, but
because you enjoy having a job.
That's right. But you know, but we did a lot of we did Justin Timberlake, and we did, you know, all kinds of things, you know. And I've been to one of his concerts, and all of the stuff that goes into that. It's a huge production, and if someone thinks that it's easy or that it is a low skill level in any way, then they just don't know anything about what's going on. So it's not my desire to belittle that. However, the reason that I brought up that song was more about the explicit nature of the subject matter and the fact that there is no subtlety, there's no allure, there's no there's no hiding or anything. It's just a very direct kind of messaging and lewd.
Yeah, and I think that reflects the society now. Okay. For instance, when you think about film, you know, or even television or something like that. Now it's almost impossible, if you want to have a hit, to not have some more salacious elements to it. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
But having said that, that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. And now so I'm about to get nerdy here for a second, okay? But they talk about the point at which television turned was the television show The Sopranos. I'm a huge Sopranos fan. Sopranos fan. And Sopranos came out about 1999 on HBO. After Sopranos, what you had to have, I mean, that's incredibly well written, well acted. It is as solid from a artistic standpoint as anything you could describe. But one of the things that Sopranos did,
except for the last episode.
even that one, you know, I kind of,
it was not very satisfying.
I kind of dug what they did.
It was not a 5-1 cadence.
That's right. It was deceptive cadence at best.
Right.
But one of the things that Sopranos did was inject into television. Now there's got to be a lot more nudity. There's got to be a lot more. There's going to be, you know, people are going to get shot in the head, going to be heads explode and all those kinds of things. And I think it's a progression. One of the things that we see in the arts in general, it's a progression. Now, that when we talk about that, we're talking about the arts as a sellable commodity, you know, as something for the masses. And there's no turning back after a while. And the same thing with hip hop, because when you think about hip hop, one of the things that I think that we forget is that hip hop is now it's coming up on its 50th year relatively soon. I mean, it's coming up on and when I say its 50th year, I'm talking about 1973, 74 in New York is where all that stuff starts, Kool Herc and all of those cats like that. It's not till 1979 that the rest of the world starts to understand what's happening. But 73, 74, they start. So you're coming up on that 70th year. So hip hop has had this really long, even though we still think of it as this new thing, this really long history. And as such, the history of hip hop has changed and progressed just like the history of jazz has changed and progressed, and the history of classical music and the history of soul music. You know, you think about R&B. R&B is quite different. Soul music is quite different than what it used to be. It's, you know, I'm talking about from a sound standpoint. I'm talking about even from the melodies. And you think about the way that people create melodies now. You don't have really long melodic lines. You have staccato melodies with a real short range. You know, that doesn't make it bad, but that just means that it's changed. Same thing with hip hop. And along with that, all of those, you know, salacious elements, you got trap music, you got what I'm trying to think of the term that comes out of Chicago. The hip hop that comes out of Chicago, I forget what it's called, but and there's all kind of weird stuff coming out of that. But the point is that it's a progression, and WAP is on that line of progression of hip hop. Now, will that pendulum swing back? Probably not. Although what's probably going to happen is, or what's happening right now, you know, the world of hip hop is going to open back up so that you have a lot of stuff that's not quite that extreme, or as my son calls it, mumble rap. You know, with all of the trap stuff, you know, where you don't understand what they're saying, and that's probably for the best, you know, considering the lyrical content. But I think the music is always on a progression, and it always has to move forward. But along with that, there's always going to be those folks that want to try to pull it back into something it was. You could even say now, and okay, to the jazz equivalent to me is Wynton Marsalis. Wynton Marsalis is a for lack of a better term, a neoconservative as far as his jazz, the way he represents jazz. And I love a lot of his music. I disagree with Wynton Marsalis a lot. I disagree with his feeling about jazz a lot. And sometimes I vehemently disagree with him. But that doesn't take away from his brilliance. That guy he's absolutely brilliant. I've heard him speak on a number of occasions. A couple, let's see, how many years ago has it been? 3 or 4 years ago at Midwest Clinic in Chicago, the Big Band Clinic. He spoke a couple times there. He was a guest artist there, and he spoke to the larger crowd in the ballroom at McCormick Place. And he talked about music, and he talked about his thoughts about music and all of that. And
yeah, he's one of
like
the he is one of the best presenters I've ever seen.
He's absolutely brilliant. He's brilliant.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think that one of my issues with him, if I could say this, is that he doesn't seem to be. He doesn't. I know he does understand this. He doesn't seem to be okay with the fact that music is supposed to change, even if we don't like it. It's supposed to change, permutate into something different. Then there'll be a movement back toward it. You know, you think about the Young Lions movement. You know, when Wynton and Branford came up, and there was all the Young Lions and Roy Hargrove and all those cats, Joshua Redman. You know, Joshua Redman when he first came on the scene. And what interesting thing about Joshua Redman, when he came on, he was signed to Warner Brothers Records at a time when Warner Brothers Records was cutting all of the jazz stuff. But they saw this young guy who's he's a handsome guy, and he plays his butt off, man. The cat can play, and he's got this real original and unique sound that he still has. And I think that they saw something different in him. And what it was is he was a drawback to an older time that, you know, counteracted some of the newer stuff that was happening in jazz. And, you know, we can talk about smooth jazz and how we might not necessarily like smooth jazz, but jazz has always been this continuum. You know, you had fusion, you had the 60s soul jazz, you had the free jazz thing that was happening, the new thing, as Amiri Baraka called it, the new thing that was happening. You had Coltrane who took the new thing to a whole different level. And so you've always had this progression as far as jazz is concerned.
Yeah, I think that Wynton's his position in the way that he talks about that is much less polemic and more. There's more gray area in the way that he talks about that topic.
Sometimes there's the polemic part of it too. Sometimes he's very confrontational about his view.
Well, understand that he is that way. I'm saying that.
Sure. Yeah.
I'm saying that there seems to be more nuance and gray area in his positions these days than it was in the past. Yeah. And I think some evidence to that fact is, he did that concert with Willie Nelson, you know.
Oh yeah.
And there's been a number of there's been a number of things like that he's kind of opened the door to. And I interviewed him, and in our conversation, he actually said a few things with respect to musical style that actually surprised me somewhat. That because, you know, my view is, I think, probably similar to the way that you are wired. I'm very eclectic, and I like music to interact and to develop and to change, and I like that, you know. Whereas it seems like in his career, the stuff that I really dig was the stuff that he was doing right before he started to sort of digress, you know, and that was the stuff. And I think a lot of folks were sort of disappointed at some of the sort of new directions that he started taking. Now, that's not to say anything about his skill level.
Oh yeah.
I can't think of, I think he's the baddest. He might be the baddest trumpet player of all time. I can't think, because he's playing both sides of the horn like that.
Right. Yeah.
I don't know who else I'm going to put in that category. The
thing that I appreciate about Wynton is his compositional skill, particularly in large works. That new thing that he's got, Ever Funky Lowdown, man, that's brilliant stuff. It's really, really brilliant stuff. And it's coming from a whole original kind of a thing. Blood on the Fields, that oratorio that he wrote, I think this beautiful stuff. City Movement. It's really cool. And so,
the funky, lowdown. I interviewed a couple of the singers from that project, because that project is so killing.
It's really cool stuff. And now going back to what you were saying earlier, that's music you got to invest some time into. And I think part of the challenge, Sean, that we both have as we're bringing these musicians up and through the university, part of the challenge we have is to get them, even though they're jazz musicians and they're studying jazz, to get them to even think in terms of a broader range of music that they want to be a part of, not just wanting to play bop stuff, or not just wanting to play, some hip hop stuff. Something like the Ever Funky Lowdown, or some of the bigger works, or think about things like the Black Saint and the Sinner Lady by Charles Mingus, or Black, Brown, and Beige by Ellington. These are pieces of music in the jazz repertoire, or even A Love Supreme. Now, and it's funny because A Love Supreme is something that a lot of people know and a lot of people like. And that is a really, really deep, dense four movement work. But it's proof that if people are exposed to it, they can like it. I think that one of the challenges we have is we have to expose people. We have to push people beyond their comfort level. And
one of the last things performances I had before the pandemic started was to present A Love Supreme in the church, and I believe that to be its natural habitat. It was right at home. It's a missionary Baptist church that I'm the minister of music at. And the pastor there is very, very progressive, and he's a musician himself, great singer. And so I told him what I wanted to do, and he was totally with it. So we brought the jazz set there, and we performed. It was uninterrupted. We played the entire suite, four movements uninterrupted. It was about 26, 27 minutes. I tried to truncate a little bit, but and this is of course when people could actually go to church, so the place is filled with folks, and they really dug it, and I'm sure that it's not something that they'd ever experienced before. Some of them may have heard the music before, but to do that in a church setting, but they were totally into it. And I think
that's the key. If we expose people, if we can open up venues and avenues for people to come into what we do, or we can take what we do out to people and expose them to it, and have a wide variety of different kinds of things. We can't be stuck on, and this is why I think one of the reasons I did the Steely Dan thing is that I wanted to bring in people that might not have ordinarily thought of coming to a jazz concert or viewing a jazz concert on a live stream. When you think of the baby boomer, particularly Midwest white baby boomer, and in that I'm describing a lot of our students' parents. I'm a baby boomer, and a lot of our students' parents will be in that generation. That's the kind of stuff that will bring them in and go, oh, wait a minute, man, I kind of like that. I didn't realize that could be considered jazz too. And maybe I can, broaden my sphere of musical influence. Maybe I can stretch out a little bit more. So I think that a large part of what the challenge is in this instant gratification world, as you describe it, is to open up and create some opportunities for people to be exposed to stuff that they wouldn't ordinarily be exposed to. Like we had to, because of the limited amount of media outlets that we had before it. Now you can cyber balkanize yourself into your own little world. Well, when you couldn't do that, you had to listen outside of your scope.
Yeah, I've always believed that audiences, if they're sophisticated or not, respond to the energy, right? Mm-hmm. The intensity, the passion that's in the music, the emotion, the subtlety. They respond to those things. And so you don't have to have studied music to be able to appreciate jazz, because, right, good jazz is going to give you all of that. It's going to give you all of that, that whole spectrum. One thing that I did frequently is I brought a group of our best students. It was a combo that we had at Ohio State, the recruiting combo. This is before we had a regular.
Oh yeah, yeah, mm-hmm.
And I would go to a couple elementary schools, and there was other schools that we went to also. But it's like fourth graders, third graders, and they're hearing the music, and it's not like the kind of stuff that I want to play, and that's the kind of stuff that we played. So it wasn't like I was like, okay, well, we're playing for kids, so let's pull out the kids' book of tunes. That's not what we did. We played the same music, and they ate it up. They just, and sometimes kids are like the best audience.
Because kids don't have a preconceived notion about what is proper for them to listen to, what's not proper. Kids are just happy when some music's going on. They're just happy to hear some horns. And perhaps one of the things that we do, and I think that we sell kids short all the time, because we don't give them opportunities to hear all the different kinds of music that there are, And now one of the things that we have to also remember is that a lot of their parents won't necessarily be listening to this music. That's why we have to open up jazz and classical music and other types of music that's not sellable. We have to open that up to the schools, and we have to be willing to go into the schools or have concerts where the schools can come to us so we can expose these kids to it. Because what you're going to find, of course, is that most kids will enjoy it, but probably won't go, okay, that's something I want to listen to again. But there's going to be a portion of them that goes, give me some more of that. I want more of that right now. Just give me more of that. But yeah, one other thing that in regard to jazz, we have created our own graveyard by making jazz the concert music and taking it out of the realm of dance music and the realm of music you can enjoy. Just, I had a long day, but let me go listen to some jazz. Let me go kick up and go listen and maybe even dance to some, my parents used to dance to jazz. They danced to jazz all the time. And Charlie Parker, the thing that people don't realize about bebop, people were still dancing to bebop. There's this story in the hit. There's an incorrect kind of a factoid that's put out there that bebop killed dancing, and that's why people stop listening to jazz, because of bebop. But bebop, when you listen to most bebop, it's still music you can dance to. It's still music that was played in the clubs. There was still music that were being, they were performing for dancers. And I think one of the things that we did wrong in the world of jazz, or the jazz world did wrong, is we aspired to be something much more like, okay, Billy Taylor is credited, the great Billy Taylor, who was a wonderful, brilliant man who explained jazz like no one else. Interviewed you on CBS Sunday Morning. The guy was just brilliant. But one of the mistakes, and I understand what his intention was, but he coined the phrase, "Jazz is America's classical music." Man, you want to kill something, you call something America's classical music. You're going to kill it right away, because most people don't have that connection with classical music. So for jazz to be called American classical music, for a lot of people, that just meant Well, that's another thing that I don't want to experience, because I don't want to go to I don't want to go to the orchestra hall anyway, So, and we've gotten away from the folks, the folk music. When I say folk music, and I'm talking about music that people can just the social aspect, going down, those organ trios playing in the clubs in Columbus where Hank Marr was playing, and the cats would come out there and they would dance to that stuff, and he'd do some nice shuffles and stuff like that. I mean, we should make sure that jazz, there's a space for socialization in the jazz world.
Yeah, definitely. Now, you were saying this thing about trying to, get students to have more of a broad palette, and and it's interesting because that's a sort of a double-edged sword, right? So you have a broad palette, but I think anyone listening to this knows that you know a lot about all of the stuff that you're into, right? So you're deep in all of the stuff that you're talking about. A problem we have now is, since there's so much access to so many kinds, so much music, frequently I'll ask students, well, so what are you into? Who do you dig? And they'll, well, I like everything. I like, well, what kind of music? Oh, I like every kind of music. I like this. I like that. I like all this stuff.
Yeah.
But then quickly you see how shallow it is, because you just ask them one question about, well, tell me about your favorite record. Okay, well, pick an artist that you dig and tell me about the record that you think. It turns kind of really wishy-washy and not not deep at all, but very quickly. So on the one hand, we want them to be deep in whatever it is that they're learning how to do. And I think one thing that's important, one thing that I definitely did is I listened to the same records over and over and over, because I was trying to absorb that music. It wasn't sort of like shuffle play on whatever random stuff was going on. It was very directional, right? But then one of the beauties of jazz studies is that success with jazz, really becoming a consummate player in jazz, learning, the fundamentals of how to write, how to arrange, in a jazz studies program, all of those kinds of things, that actually prepares you for a career in pretty much any kind of commercial music, right? So any of these other kinds of styles of music. And I'm somewhat resistant to refer to some of these other styles of music as being essentially different, because I don't think they're essentially different. I think they're superficially different. I think that there is nuance
different from from all the other styles, or different from jazz. How do you mean different?
All of that, because I think all of the stuff sort of comes from the same place. And if you can figure out what the general rules are, and then, obviously, whatever you have the most skin in the game, that's what you're going to sound most authentic at, right? But there's nothing that would preclude you from being able to sound authentic at several different styles of music if you have that jazz foundation, which I think gives you all of the sort of important is not the right word, all the foundational elements necessary.
Sure. Well, yeah, I guess I see what you're saying. I think that one of the ways that I became well-versed, well, first of all, I've been curious about all music from the get-go. I mean, I just want to take it all in. But one of the other things is that at different points in my life, I was so let's say in the late 70s, early 80s, there's a time when simultaneously I was in a jazz fusion band. I played with a jazz big band in Chicago. I was in a rock band, a horn rock band. I was in a punk band. I was in an orchestra. And I was doing all of that simultaneously as a working musician, while also, studying as a college student, or when I was first teaching in Chicago. And that afforded me an opportunity to be exposed to all this different music. Right. I think one of the things that I would like to see our students be able to do is to be able to do that kind of thing that I was able to do. Be able to play in orchestras, be able to play in concert bands, be able to play, or be able to play. How many of our students, if they had to do it tomorrow, put together a gig to back up a hip hop artist who was doing some just doing some freestyling, and they had to create some grooves for that, or go in the studio and do that kind of thing. How many of our students could do that and do it well? And I think that that's one of the things that I'm saying when I say, being exposed to this wide variety of stuff. Yeah. For instance, I've been a conductor, a band and orchestra conductor. And so one of the ways I learned to really get deep into the classical repertoire was as a percussionist in orchestras, because there are times as a percussionist when you got a lot to do, but then there are times when you don't have much to do at all. And the example that I had, the perfect example I give is this piece. There's a piece by Gabriel Fauré, the great French composer, Gabriel Fauré, and he's got a piece, a requiem, that might be the most beautiful requiem of all time. I mean, there's so many great requiems, but Fauré's requiem is absolutely stunningly beautiful. And I was in orchestra, and I got the orchestral music for it, and it was only one percussion part, and I got it, and it was like 8 notes in the 6th movement, which is the Libérame. And that was all it was. And I got that part, and I'm like, damn, why do you give me this, man? I don't want this. Give me something with a lot of... So I had to play it anyway. So I had to sit there and listen to that. And I swear, I fell so hard in love with that piece of music because it's so ungodly beautiful. I mean, it's so amazingly beautiful. But it's one of those where it's kind of like, had I not had to sit and listen to that, I probably wouldn't know the Fauré Requiem. But because I did, that's one of those pieces. You got those pieces of music. You got all this. I got this list of music that I want to be playing as I'm slipping from this mortal coil. Going into the next realm. All of this music. I got this playlist of music when I'm dying that I want to be playing. And the Fauré Requiem is on there. But it's the kind of thing that it's because I was exposed to it that right. I was able to go, oh my gosh. Same thing with, there's some stuff we played in concert band when I was in high school, the Overture to Die Meister Singers by Wagner. All of a sudden I wanted to know more about Wagner, and oh man, this is cool stuff, And so I think that the exposure is what has not only made me a musician that played all this stuff, but has made me a historian that can talk about all this stuff, teach all of this stuff, and make these connections. That's what I'm talking about, Sean, when I say a lot of the musicians that we have. Now, you're right. There's nothing wrong with going deep into that one thing and going deep, 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 deep into the jazz realm and being able to arrange, being able to know as much as you can about the Coltrane quartets, in the 60s, and know everything about that, or compare that quartet to the Miles's quintet and all of the other stuff, or Coltrane stuff in the 50s to the stuff in the 60s. So there's nothing wrong with going into that stuff deeply like that. As a matter of fact, that's another skill that we need to do. But then that goes back to one other thing. We have to allow our students the opportunity to experience this music and listen. And I mean, that's something that has to be a part of it. You got to know this history. And unfortunately, most of these people don't have the background that I had, and I was exposed to this music. My dad was playing this music for me as from the word go. I mean, from I remember Kind of Blue from being a baby. I mean, I was listening to that. That might be the first music that I've ever heard. That's the first music I'm conscious of is all blues and Kind of Blue. And all of that stuff that my mom and dad, but particularly my dad, exposed me to. And there's so many different kinds of music, and I think that that's the key. We have to be able to we have to raise a much more literate, musically literate generation of students, because that, I think, is the problem. They're just not very musically literate at all.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. Of course, my experience with music, I think, is the way that you describe yours. All kinds of different kind of music. I mean, I produced a couple hip hop artists, when I was a late teenager. I was a big hip hop head growing up. I listened to everything. The 80s power ballads, are that's a formative moment. And then, the movies that those songs were in, like the Karate Kid movies and the Rocky and all that stuff, and I, playing in church, playing, playing.
And that's a whole nother stream right there, man.
Right.
Church
playing
music,
in rock bands. Right. Playing in rock bands, playing in different kinds of churches. I was, working at Vineyard Columbus, where it's very, very much guitar driven and more like a rock kind of concert kind of format. And now I'm at a Missionary Baptist church, which is about as different as possible. But all of that stuff is facilitated by good fundamentals in music, a desire to a broad palette. I like a lot of different kinds of music. The willingness to say yes, even when I initially did not have experience in a particular kind of music. I did that workshop at, it wasn't a workshop, it was a presentation, The Power of Yes.
Oh, yeah, I remember that,
Developing skills for a career in the music industry.
Right.
And, you're not born with experience. And so, so you have to be willing to put yourself in situations that you're not native. Because there's no such thing as native.
And the idea of being comfortable being uncomfortable. You know what I'm saying? That's where I think that we have made it people. And this may be a broad generalization, and I may be off base, but I think people expect to be comfortable in everything that they do, and not. I can't tell you the number of times when I went into a musical situation or started off in a musical situation going, ooh, man, I don't know if I can do this, but, I want to try. I'm supposed to be able to do this. I played with a guy named Phil Coran, who was one of the founders of the AACM in Chicago, the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians. And along with Muhal Richard Abrams and Fred Anderson. Those three guys created the AACM that the Art Ensemble of Chicago came out of. Henry Threadgill came out of. Maurice White actually played with Phil Coran too. But I played with this guy. Phil Coran just passed away 3 years ago. He was in his mid-90s, about mid-90s. Absolute brilliant. But when I played with him, I was 22 years old. I played with him from the time I was 22 to I was 24. And his music was so challenging. As a matter of fact, it's even now, after all these years, difficult for me to describe what that music was like. But it was kind of like a cross between Sun Ra, Charles Mingus, Ornette Coleman, and some Coltrane's more spiritual stuff, and some blues. And I mean, it was constantly pushing me, constantly pushing me. And there were so many times that I'd go to rehearsals and he just look at me and shake his head. And it was like, man, you're not listening. You're not doing. And then I do something right. And yeah. And I get excited. But he pushed me, and I cannot even tell you, Sean, how important that was for me. But that's one of the things that I think is a challenge for young musicians now. You got to be willing to be uncomfortable. And not only young musicians, but people who listen to music. You have to be okay with being uncomfortable so that you can get comfortable, so that you can get to the point where, oh, wait a minute, I get it. It's like when you first experience.
It's hard sometimes even to get students to go to jam sessions.
Right.
Well, you know what? Check it out. You don't have to play. Bring your horn with you. You don't have to play. Just go, show up, just do some socializing, demystify the thing. I mean, I'll tell, students over and over, you got to get to a jam session, and it'll be months go by. And then they finally, I finally went to a jam session. Well, did you play? Well, I didn't play yet, but
but I was there.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, it's just that, and it is in that uncomfortable setting. That's when you grow. That's the one thing that's when you really grow, is when all of a sudden you've had to really double down and kind of dig in and, okay, I got to study this. I mean, now I'm comfortable doing that. And all of a sudden, before you know it, then you got another thing in your, another quiver in your another arrow in your quiver. You got another thing that you can do. And I think that's what we have to make young musicians understand. The more you can get uncomfortable, the more you can then become comfortable, the more things you can do, the more you start to realize, man, that world of music is just as broad and as wide as anything. And you can work all the time, and you can teach anything, and you can, write about things.
Yeah. Sometimes, I don't know. I don't, I can't understand how someone could be bored in music. Like sometimes, that doesn't make any sense to me because it's such a incredibly broad and deep at the same time, area, field. It's just, there's so much stuff. And you can get involved in stuff that's even just on the music technology side. I mean, that's still part of the, that's still part of the, part of the business. You can get involved in, buddy of mine from school. He, initially he went to law school because he wanted to do entertainment law. That's that's an avenue. Obviously there's the, teaching public schools, or teaching at the, at the university level, or teaching privately. I've got some great buddies of mine that have huge studios that they've been teaching private lessons for all these years. And, but they're also, professionals. Part of this is about having multiple streams, of income. There's that whole, balancing act. Before I took the job to the job I'm in now, and I don't know that my situation is essentially different now, because I think I have the same number of jobs now as I had then. But I had 5 jobs. I applied for this job, but I had 5 jobs. I was a part-time band director at a church. I was, I was teaching 20 students out of my house. I was a professional musician. I was going to conferences. I was, gigging about 5 nights a week, rehearsing, writing music, putting recordings out, getting my website happening, all of that stuff. I was a orchestra director. This is actually where I got my insurance my benefits, I was full time at a orchestra director at a high school in Lansing, and then I was part time band director at a charter school in another school district. That they allowed me to do 2 days a week in the evening so that I could do it. But that's what you do. That's what you. I mean, that's what this is. It certainly wasn't boring.
Yeah. Well, and it's now, I mean, you were a gig worker before that was called a gig worker, and right. Now that's what people are doing. That whole idea of side hustle becoming, you got a bunch of different side hustles that become one big main hustle, but that goes back to the idea of the more different kinds of things that you can do, the more different kinds of stuff that knowing repertoire, I mean, and then when it comes down to is knowing repertoire, knowing what's appropriate for all those different settings, if you're going to be at a charter school or if you're going to be doing a marching band, or if you're going to be doing some church music and what kind of church music, when people talk about church music, I mean, that world of church music is so broad. Now, I mean, it's more broad than it ever has been. Now the things that fall under that heading of, I mean, that's one of the things you do, so, I mean, there's such a wide world of stuff out there. So now, and the other thing, Sean, that absolutely amazes me is now it's so easy to experience that music, because all you got to do is pick up your phone and go, man, I want to just listen to this or that. I mean, it's right there. You don't have to go that far. And I think one of the other challenges might be is because there's so many offerings, it's easy to say that there are too many, and just say, I'm just done with it. I'm going to stick with the tried and true, So, I mean, there are challenges that are brought about because of technology. There may be too much exposure, too much media, that's very well could be a thing too.
Well, it's interesting because, you were mentioning, back when there were only a few, television stations or news organizations or record companies, right? There was only a few of them. And so they sort of were the gatekeepers, right? So
right.
Good, bad, or indifferent, the standard was the same for the material. Right. Whereas these days, first of all, home studios are common. You're not necessarily in these multi-million-dollar studios to record stuff with an engineer that has worked with all of the big hit makers for the last 30 years or whatever. It's not necessarily that. And then you can release stuff on YouTube. You can release it on
SoundCloud.
Yeah. There's all these different ways, and then all the social media, and there's all of these ways to get your stuff out, but there's also not the same sort of gatekeeping. There's not the same standards available. So I think you have to have more of a discriminating. You have to have some sort of way to weed things out that's efficient, because you can end up swimming in a bunch of stuff that's not necessarily, the best stuff.
Yeah, but something I wonder, and everything you're saying is right, but I wonder if for some people, if that even matters, because I got a friend of mine who's my friend's daughter is married to a guy, and that guy's sister has TikTok videos that make her a ton of money. Now I don't know anything about that whole world of people making money on TikTok, monetizing that. But what I do know is that people who do know about that, and they're making a bunch of money. And a lot of the stuff that they're doing is that doesn't really take, it's not meant for deep consumption. I mean, it's something that we would consider to be just trite fluff, but they're making a living at that, you know. And you know, the other thing that I think that has fascinated me lately is that there is a guy that I heard interviewed on NPR, and I forget what his name is, but his job, what he does is he creates snare drum sounds, not even snare drum patterns, snare drum sounds that he's emulating different sounds that people want. And he puts them on his website and they pay him and he gives them, like, for instance, if you want a fat, like Al Jackson Stax record snare drum sound, he can give you that. Or if you want a really tight kind of a piccolo snare drum, he'll give you that. He's making money in the music business because they're people. So what they do, of course, is they'll get that snare drum sound, they'll put it in, they'll program it in, and that's what the sound that they get. So now there's a whole world. I mean, I'm fascinated by this. I'm sure there are people who are going to be listening to this laughing at me because I'm so amazed by the fact that there's this world out there. But I am amazed by the fact that the music world is very different than it used to be, in that you don't have to have such a discriminating palette. You can just keep things at a really not so deep level, and that's okay. You know, there are people who are making money doing that kind of stuff.
You know, we're I'm gonna have to have you back, man, because I feel like we're only kind of scratching the surface so far.
Yeah.
But you know, there's all these conferences that academics tend to go to, and that we encourage our students to go to. And one of the conferences that I would like to see academics go to themselves and refer their students to is the NAMM show, National Association of Music Merchants. Of course, it's the biggest kind of conference. There's a big one in Germany that's about
yes, I've heard about that. Yeah,
times the size of the NAMM show.
Yeah,
the NAMM show, the Anaheim NAMM show, the Winter NAMM, is the biggest conference, music conference of any kind. It dwarfs everything. Everything is swallowed up by the massive. Yeah. You know, size of this conference. But part of the reason why it can be so big is because it incorporates all aspects of music. Yeah. And I think it gives folks a better sort of angle on how huge the music industry is, and on all these different aspects, you know, all these different directions that you can go. I mean, a lot of kids. I mean, you can play, you get your degree, and then you end up being a rep for a saxophone company or something.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
That's a very common thing. But that's not going to be an option for you if you haven't done anything to create any of those connections.
Right. Yeah. You got to know that it's out there. I mean, you got to know that that's a job. You know, or you know, being a rep for that company, for the schools. You're just the school rep for Selmer, you know, or for something like that. I mean, your whole job is to represent them at schools. I mean, that kind of thing is a industry thing that most people have no idea that that's something. Obviously, people get paid for that. I went to the NAMM show. The NAMM show was in Chicago a couple years in the 80s, 82 and 83, I think it was. And I don't know what the reason was for that, but for 2 years it was in Chicago. And I went when it was in Chicago, and it was mind-boggling. I mean, you're walking around. I had on a badge, and you're walking around. One of my favorite drummers is the British drummer, Bill Bruford. Bill Bruford, who played in King Crimson, he played the band Yes, had his own bands. So I'm walking around the corner, and there's Bruford. And I walked up to him, and I said, Bill Bruford, hey, man, how you doing? And he says, hey, I'm fine, Mike. How are you? I'm like, how do you know my name? And I forgot that I had a name tag on there. Oh, yeah. But, you know, it's funny because you're walking around and there are all of these people. But, it's a tremendous. Yeah,
I mean, you could be walking around. You could be walking around. Oh, there's Prince. Oh, there's Stevie.
Yeah.
Stevie's right there.
Yep. Steve. Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
heck. Herbie Hancock. I mean, it's
Yeah,
like that.
yeah.
Victor Wooten.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
dude, this is Victor Wooten. It's like,
Yep.
it's just like that.
Herbie was at the one in Chicago that it was at. Yeah. And so, yeah, it's amazing. So you're right. And it's about, being out there and getting out there and seeing the larger world of music that's out there. So, yeah.
All right. Well, Mike, I appreciate your time and your energy.
It was fun, man. A lot of fun.
You're incredibly knowledgeable. I definitely will have to have you back. I want to say that I've enjoyed working with you all these years, and I look forward to continuing to develop, cultivate our students side by side.
Well, we do it. I was going to say we have a good time doing it too. So right back at you, man. We work well together. So let's keep doing it. But this has been a blast. I've thoroughly enjoyed this.
Yeah, likewise. Like I said, I definitely will have to have you back because we were just getting going.
That's right. We can do this all day, man. Yeah. Well, like I said, let me know, and we'll come back again. But this is a cool series that you do as well. I've viewed a few of them, and they're always very, very cool. So I appreciate being a part of it.
All right. Well, you have a good one, man. God bless you.
All right. See you soon, man.
All right, man.